because then most loans tend to come out good. So they're good investors. But Bank 3 takes on extra risk. You write it down. Extra risk. And what's their incentive for taking extra risk? Let's say that Bank 3 is willing to lend to people that Banks 1 and 2 weren't willing to lend to. So Bank 3's balance sheet here, these loans are going to be riskier loans. Now why would they do that? Because when you give it to riskier people, you're able to take more interest from them. So they take extra risk, which leads to extra interest from their extra interest. And actually, if you were to look at these banks, you would say that this guy is the most profitable bank. The most profitable. Most profitable. Even worse, because he's getting extra interest, he can actually share more of that extra interest with their depositors. So you can give higher yielding checking accounts, I guess I could call it. Higher interest on deposits. So in this situation, the person who's taking the most risk is going to be the most profitable, and they're going to give the higher interest, and they might actually attract the most deposits, right? If all of these guys look the same to me, and we all know it's very hard to know what banks are actually doing with their money, then I'll say, hey, I'm going to give my money to this guy right over there. But then what happens as soon as things go bad? As soon as the world gets a little bit difficult, this extra risk actually starts rearing its ugly head, and then this guy becomes insolvent. So this guy, let me see if I can draw his balance sheet. His balance sheet will look something like this. He has a bunch of loans out. He has got some reserves right there. And then he's got a bunch of deposits that you or I might have given him. These are our IOUs to us. These are his loans out. As soon as things start going bad, some of these loans are going to go bad. As soon as one of those loans go bad, I'm going to hear about it on the news, and I'm going to run over to the bank, and I'm going to say, let me get my money back as quickly as possible. And let's say I'm the first one there, and I get my money back. They promised it to me, so I would draw my account right there, and I get all my money back, and I essentially deplete the reserves. Now the next guy is going to come along. This guy was a little bit of a slower runner than me. He comes to the bank and he says, give me back my reserves. And the bank says there are no reserves. And then this guy is mad. He has no reserves. And of course the whole time this bank's assets are just becoming worthless because he had loaned it to people who invested it badly. And so you have all of these people, when he finds out that this guy didn't get his money, all of these people are going to go there and demand their money, and the bank is going to be insolvent. Well, it's going to be two things. It's going to be illiquid and insolvent, and I've explained the difference. But illiquid might mean it might have, the loans might be good, and actually I'll explain it, I'll reiterate it in this video, but the loans might be good, it just doesn't have the cash. Insolvent means that these loans aren't even good, that the value of these loans aren't equal to these deposits. So I'll say that this risky bank is insolvent. Is insolvent. Now, that you might say these guys right here deserve it. These guys deserve what they got because they were greedy. They invested in this risky bank that was doing shady things just to get a little bit higher interest on their deposits. But what happens when this happens? Well, you have these good banks over here. These good banks over here that maybe did really conservative lending. They did really conservative lending, so this is what their balance sheets, maybe both of their balance sheets look like this. They have some reserves right there, and then they've made out some good loans to good entrepreneurs. And then you have their depositors. These are their depositors right there. But as soon as this guy finds out about what happened at that bank, he's like, things are really bad. Let me just be careful and go to my bank, let's say it's this depositor right here, and take my money out and put it into my mattress. So he goes to the bank, and he's the first one there. He's the fastest runner of all of the depositors. So he claims his deposit. So his deposit he withdraws, and he depletes all of the reserves. He depletes all the reserves. Now, he wasn't the only guy who was afraid. This guy was afraid as well. So he comes running to the bank, and the bank now says, gee, I know I promised you, I know I made this promise to you that you have an on-demand account, But that guy you saw leaving the bank with the running shoes on, he actually just took all of the reserves. And I guess I have to admit now that I lied to you, that it isn't completely on demand. I actually loaned out the rest of your money. But I was a good banker. You know, these are actually good loans. These loans are still worth what they want. If you just wait long enough, you'll get your money back. And of course, this guy is going to be not so happy because he was lied to. And that's not going to be the only guy. There's slightly slower runners are going to come there and also demand their money. And this is known as a bank run. This is a bank run where, because one maybe bad apple in the system actually is insolvent, everyone becomes afraid and comes and says, give me my money. And because we have this fractional reserve system, the money isn't there. It just will not be there because 90% of it is lent out. And so once this happens here, then you're going to have a run on bank 2, and then everyone is going to take their money out of the banking system. So the whole banking system, this situation right here where the assets maybe still are worth the same or more than the liabilities, this guy is still solvent, but he doesn't have any money to pay these on-demand accounts. So this guy is running into a liquidity problem. He doesn't have the reserves. And that's why we have the whole Federal Reserve that's a lender of last resort. This guy can go walk to the Federal Reserve and say, hey, I have some people knocking on my door, give me some loans. The Federal Reserve will lend this guy some money, and of course then this guy is going to have another depositor or another lender to it called the Federal Reserve, and he can use this to pay off these guys. But that leaves another question. How does the Federal Reserve really know the difference between this guy? He might say, okay, this guy is good. Let me just lend to him to make sure that he doesn't have a liquidity problem. How does the Federal Reserve really know the difference between this guy and this guy right here? This guy's going to also run to the Federal Reserve. Hey, Federal Reserve, these loans are still good. Just give me a loan so I can pay these people right there. So the Federal Reserve says, hey, you look good. You're a nice, clean banker in a nice, fancy building you have a Rolex on your arm. You must be good for it. So the Federal Reserve will also lend this guy. And now this guy also owes the Federal Reserve some money. You can already see that in this fractional reserve banking system, you have two problems. You have an unstable equilibrium. Unstable equilibrium, where one bad apple can lead to a run on the entire system. One bad bank leads to a run on the entire system. And I'll talk about what's been engineered to fix this problem, essentially banking insurance. I'll probably wait for that to the next video. So this is the first problem right here. And then the second problem is that it really becomes hard to differentiate between the good and bad banks. Hard to differentiate. I mean, it's not so hard to differentiate at face. Well, it is hard to differentiate at first, and it becomes even harder to differentiate when you always have the Federal Reserve willing to be a lender of last resort. And when I talk about the Federal Reserve insurance, that makes it even harder to differentiate. And because it's harder to differentiate, there's a huge incentive for banks to take on risk. Because when times are good, they'll make more money than everyone else. And then when times are bad, it's really hard that they'll all suffer equally. So in the next video, I'll talk about some of what has been engineered to fix these problems and see if they actually make sense. I wish I reached that skyline.